Some were much less so. Some, as the American government expands, try to work as complicitly as possible, like the Cherokee, and they get still treated horribly for it. The Algonquins were quite warlike, and they did historically scalp. So that's one thing there. This came to my mind as we were talking about the first sensual scene with Gary Oldman. Really a way to subvert your expectations there when this is being, pitched as a Demi Moore movie. This is something I'm surprised people don't realize. I read a question on Quora. It's this site where people submit questions and you get expert answers. I read it a lot. Someone asked, what did people use for bathing suits before the 1900s? And there was a very long answer where they said, well, they swam naked. That's just what you did. And even if you look in ancient sources, if you see mosaics of fishermen, they're actually working naked because just among same gender, it wasn't thought of that big of a deal. And I think this historical account I read, they mentioned at the end of one of the gospel accounts when Peter and John are fishing, it mentions their nakedness. So this is something, at least, especially in poorer life, when you only wore one set of clothing, would be common. That's, again, like very tangential to the plot. So you see how far I'm having to reach here to see what's good. Let me think if I can think of anything else. Oh, okay. This was it. Now, like you said, the movie starts out ridiculously with Demi Moore scandalizing people with her European fashion, like as if like anyone but royalty would have opulent fashion in the 1630s. And you're definitely not bringing that stuff to Puritan America. No. But what they're trying to do is they're making her a 1995 woman and plunking her in the past. And we talked about the Crusade movie, Kingdom of Heaven, and I just ripped this to shred. I hated the movie where Orlando Bloom's character is a 21st century man trying to preach interreligious tolerance to people in the Crusades, and it's stupid. What I think is good theoretically about this movie, and again, this is good in theory, not good in execution, is that the original Scarlet Letter novel is also ahistorical in some ways. I mean, if you remember your high school English, there's a lot of themes of transcendentalism in that book, and that was a popular belief system and philosophy at that time from the 1830s to about the 1850s when it was written, where the idea that you can experience and see the divine in nature and corrupting sinful influences can be put upon us socially. And that's a theme where Hester is removed in the forest and around the divinity of nature. But it's this, the judgmentalism and hypocrisy of society is what she's up against. So and I don't mind historical fiction that addresses 21st century issues. I mean, I don't want all historical fiction to be like a Discovery Channel documentary or an academic thesis, by no means. And great works of historical fiction can address common concerns while still being faithful to what characters of that time would have experienced. A good example is The Crucible, the Arthur Miller play set during the Salem witch trials, and it was an allegory for communism and the Red Scare and McCarthyism. So it addresses contemporary concerns, but it does so by pointing at universal issues of paranoia and crowd psychology and moral panic and overcoming these things. But it manages to address these universal themes with Puritan characters that are faithful to what people like that would have been. So theoretically, this movie could have done the same by addressing themes of 1995. I don't even, what was the point of this movie, Steve? What was the theme? I'm trying to figure out what it was trying to say. Can you?
I think that it inversed the themes of the novel. In the novel, the theme is guilt and sin and how people dealt with that in a confined society, where in the movie, it's really saying, it's a 1995 message of, I'm a woman and I'm a man and we're going to be together no matter what society says. And, then we're going to flip society on its head and then run away. that's the theme that that's the only theme that I'm able to pull out of it, is really it's an individualistic theme where the novel is really showing how people had to basically suck it up and deal with making mistakes, and how they individually dealt with those in really a closed society.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Yeah, I mean, that's the problem where, like, the type of radical individualism, the way they do it in the movie, and I think, isn't Hester about to be hanged when she's pregnant?
Yeah.
Which just, like, would not happen in a trillion years. Like, you would, except for murder, you wouldn't hang a woman. I mean, if she were indicted for witchcraft, that's one thing, but America was built on shotgun weddings and people who got knocked up and then went to another town. My grandfather, rest in peace, is part of that story, and my grandmother too. So America is built on that. You just, go out into the woods or go to a next town, and it's not as quite that big of a deal. I mean, that's Nathaniel Hawthorne is doing that for dramatic element, but when she has the child, she's merely just ostracized from society.
Yeah.
And it's informal ostracization, which up into the early to mid 20th century, the same thing in the United States, where if you were a female who got pregnant in high school, so to say, you would, quote unquote, go stay with your grandmother for a while. And the townspeople might know what that meant, but they wouldn't say anything out of politeness. And then you would return and give a child up for adoption. If you were to openly flaunt your pregnancy out of wedlock, then you would be informally ostracized from society. But in Puritan colonies, by no means, you wouldn't be hung by any means. So to have kind of like the grand speech about how we're going to subvert this social order, it doesn't work at all. It's whatever it's trying to say. It adds to the mountain of silliness that is this movie.
And in the end, I really think that the thread that connects all these movies that we've talked about that we hate is that they're really trying to tell a story of the time the film's being made, be it in 2001 and the War on Terror with Kingdom of Heaven, or 1995 with this movie. Another thing with this movie was, I remember in 1995 living up in New York, and in this New York, New England area, everybody was moving to North Carolina in the 1990s. You'd probably have like 2 uncles and an aunt who had moved down there, and half your friends moved down there. So it was kind of like a boogeyman that, your entire neighborhood was going to clear out and move to some place in North Carolina you'd never heard of. And I honestly think that that's where they came up with that they were moving to Carolina, the Carolinas, to start over again. It was that silly, really. Okay, yeah, that's a deep cut right there. Yeah. But, this is good to talk about, just how silly it is that you go to the Carolinas. That is a ridiculously far overland journey in the 1600s. There's not even a colony there at that time, is there? Well, that's the interesting part. Just a little of the history of the Carolina colony to show how silly that is. The Carolina colony was originally chartered as basically the land of North Carolina, a little bit of Tennessee, and South Carolina. That was chartered in the 1820s, but for a couple of different reasons, it was only chartered on paper. Nobody had actually set up an establishment there. There had been a couple of, failure to start colonies and settlements there, but nothing really. The first really permanent colony there was actually something the Spanish had set up. So they certainly weren't going to go to a Spanish colony that had basically gone defunct about close to 3/4 of a century before the time of this movie. Then after that, the first permanent settlement was more just a few miles away from modern day Charleston, South Carolina. And that colony was basically on the verge of failure for several decades until it established itself. So that was not a place where you were necessarily going to go to start a new life. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure of this, the people who had moved to Charleston, who set up what it was called Charlestown, were from Bermuda, and they had failed at farming in Bermuda, and that was kind of their last hope, was setting up in Charlestown. So that's not necessarily the place where you're going to be smiling to go to as your next stop after you've gotten kicked out of Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into geography of time and place of 17th century America. It's so stupid that they could have chosen anything if they're going to make up a new ending. And South Carolina, like you said, no one lives there. To go overland is so dangerous. You're encountering multiple Indian tribes. Many of them may not be friendly because they've had poor dealings with other European colonists. That's like a Lewis and Clark expedition with a woman who's pregnant. When you could have had so many other choices at hand, really, you could go a few villages away in New England. Theoretically, if our Dimmsdale is a high-profile enough figure, maybe his reputation would follow him. I guess take a ship down to the Virginia colonies with the tobacco plantations, go all the way to the Caribbean. Those are much more built up in the 17th century. But, I mean, just like geographical scope, I mean, maybe today you have to, if you do something to cause a scandal in your town, you have to go to another state. To get a sense of how different geography is before steamships and railroads, when you could reliably travel hundreds of miles in a day, I read a number of travel logs when I was doing some different historical research in, I think it was the 18th century, and you're limited vastly. If you're on foot, it's 10, 15 miles a day. 20 miles is like a forced march of a soldier. If you're on a horse, it's a little faster, but then after 30 miles, you're very uncomfortable riding that long. All that to say, your scope completely changes. And 10, 20 miles away, you could be completely unknown in a village or a setting you're in. So you do not have to go very far at all. Before the age of newspapers, especially before people really have much comings and goings with one another, it's when we just think of Puritan society as being omnipresent and this panopticon that sees everything you do and you're judged. In a very tightly knit, close community, that can happen. But if that wasn't for you, it's very simple just to move into the woods and get away from it. Boom, taken care of. You don't have to go to another state. So just a little bit of a geographic segue. But I don't want to steal your thunder, Steve, because there's so much else to talk about what's bad with this movie.
Just so much bad. So much bad. I think, like we've been just saying, this movie does not stand the test of time. It's very dated. I think getting into our next phase, if we can, to just get out of we got to crawl out of the negativity here. What would you do to make this movie a better movie?
Like, from a historical standpoint, as film, it doesn't work if you're going to have someone with completely modern sensibilities, you can't try to have someone who's going to upend puritanical society with 21st century gender politics, because that's too far out there to make it work. I mean, you could have keep the theme of not undue punishment on someone where social pressure causes undue punishment that exceeds what is justified by the crime. Because I can't even say radical individuality, because that doesn't even make much sense in this context. So, I mean, other than like stick things pretty close to the novel, then not change the novel. I mean, it just didn't work. Oh, I guess I would say this. One way that you could conceivably make this better, Robert Duvall, they do incorporate Native American society into this, and I guess the Algonquins sort of come off positively, because it's thanks to them that Hester is able to escape, because, you know, a flaming arrow shoots her down. And as we both know, I mean, if an arrow is shot, it's always flaming.
Yeah.
That always makes sense in 100% of context, because, well, I mean, it's easy to light one. The flame always does something that just a regular arrow wouldn't do.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense to stop in combat to light an arrow rather than fire them as quickly as possible. So the Algonquins sort of come off okay in this because the what's his name gets kicked out. Roger gets kicked out of the tribe for being too crazy. If you want to get